Say the name Geronimo and something happens in the American imagination. A face appears, high cheekbones, dark eyes that carry something the camera cannot quite name. A rifle across the knees. The photograph is real. The man in it was real. But the story that grew up around that image, the one Hollywood spent a century building, the one that turned a bet-on-Cochise warrior into a kind of permanent symbol of wild, undifferentiated Indian resistance, that story left out almost everything that actually mattered. Say the name Cochise and something similar happens. A different face, this one drawn rather than photographed. A tall man wrapped in dignity and silence, the noble chief who made peace and then watched the peace dissolve. Hollywood liked that version too. It made a film out of it in 1950, put a white actor in the role, and sent it to theaters across America. People came out thinking they understood something. Most of them understood very little. This is not a complaint about old movies. It is an observation about what happens when history gets compressed into a single face, a single name, a single act of defiance or surrender. What gets lost is everything underneath. The land, the specific, irreplaceable geography of a place called the Chiricahua homeland, and why every military officer who ever tried to operate there came away humbled by it. The long sequence of broken agreements, each one slightly different from the last, each one producing a different kind of damage. The individual bands, the Chokanans, the Bedonkohes, the Warm Springs people, each one with its own leadership, its own territory, its own calculation about when to fight and when to negotiate. The Apache scouts who wore U.S. Army uniforms and tracked their own kinsmen through the mountains, and whose loyalty to this day is one of the most complicated questions in the history of the American frontier. The years of exile, the prisoners of war who were still classified as prisoners of war when the 20th century was already old, all of that is the actual story. Cochise and Geronimo are entry points into it, not the whole of it. They are the two names that survived the compression of popular memory, the two men who became large enough to cast shadows across everything else. But to understand either of them, you have to understand what they were moving through. You have to understand the terrain, not just as landscape, but as strategy. You have to understand what the United States wanted in the 1850s and 1860s when it pushed into the Southwest, what it was willing to do to get it, and what the people who already lived there were willing to do to remain. You have to understand Mexico, because this war did not stop at the border. It spilled across it constantly, and the Apache bands moved through that border country as if the line did not exist, because for most of their history, it had not. What you are going to find in this story is not a simple war between civilization and savagery, which is roughly what the old movies offered you. What you are going to find is a conflict shaped by geography and betrayal, by the mobility of people who knew their mountains better than any army ever would, and by the slow, grinding machinery of American expansion that required land and required peace on that land, and was willing to produce that peace through force when nothing else worked. You are going to find commanders who acted in good faith and commanders who did not. You are going to find warriors who wanted nothing more than to be left alone in the country their grandparents had known, and leaders who understood, earlier than most, that being left alone was no longer an option anyone in Washington was prepared to offer. The Apache Wars did not begin with a single incident, and they did not end cleanly. They stretched across roughly 30 years, from the early 1860s into the mid-1880s, and the events of those decades produced consequences that ran for decades more. Some of the men and women who survived this war spent the rest of their lives in military custody on the other side of the continent, far from the mountains they had defended. Some of their children did too. That is the story this documentary is going to try to tell properly. Not just the famous names and the famous photographs, the whole shape of it. The land first, then the betrayal, then the war, then what came after. Before we go any further, I want to ask something of you, because these documentaries reach people in places I will never see from a desk. Wherever you are right now, whether it is early morning and the coffee is still hot or late at night and the house has gone quiet, leave it in the comments. Tell me where you are and what time it is there. I find myself genuinely curious about the geography of who is listening to these stories, and I read more of those comments than you might expect. Now, let us go to the mountains, because that is where this story begins, and, in many ways, where it never entirely ended. The mountains in question are not the mountains most Americans picture when they think of the West. The Rockies, the Sierra Nevada, the great dramatic ranges that appear on calendars and national park posters. The country we are talking about is different. It is smaller in scale and more violent in character. The Chiricahua Mountains of southeastern Arizona rise out of the desert floor like something the earth decided to argue with itself about. Below them, cactus and creosote and the flat, bone-dry basin country. Above a certain elevation, pine trees, running water, cool air, the possibility of survival. That contrast between what the desert floor withholds and what the mountains provide is not background detail. It is the entire logic of how people lived here for generations before any American soldier or settler arrived to complicate things. The Chiricahua Apache homeland did not sit within tidy borders. It spread across what is now southeastern Arizona, southwestern New Mexico, and the northern Mexican states of Sonora and Chihuahua. It was a country organized around geography rather than lines on paper. The Dragoon Mountains, the Dos Cabezas, the Palancillos, the Sierra Madre in Mexico, which ran south like a spine through country that American maps barely acknowledged. These ranges were not obstacles to the people who lived among them. They were home in the most practical and specific sense. They contained water. They contained food. They contained positions of advantage that any military mind, once it had spent time in that country, could not help but recognize as extraordinary. Water shaped everything. In the basin country between the ranges, water was scarce and the sources were known, cataloged in the memory of every family that moved through the region. A spring that appeared on no American map was known by Apache families who had stopped there for generations. A seep in a canyon wall, visible only if you knew the exact rock formation to look for. The locations of these sources were not simply geographical knowledge. They were a form of wealth, passed from older family members to younger ones, part of the inheritance of anyone who survived in this country. When the United States Army eventually learned to contest those water sources, it was learning something the Apache had understood as a matter of survival for centuries. Now, one thing that gets distorted almost immediately in popular accounts of this story is the idea of the Apache as a single unified nation. They were not. Apache identity in the mid-19th century was organized around bands, around family groups and local leaders, whose authority came from demonstrated competence and the consent of those who followed them. The Chiricahua as a whole were a cluster of related peoples who shared language, culture, and kinship networks. But within that cluster, there were distinct bands with their own territories and their own leadership structures. The Chokanans, who were the band most closely associated with the Chiricahua Mountains themselves, and whose leaders included the man we know as Cochise. The Bedonkohes, a smaller band from the mountains further east, the Mogollon country of what is now New Mexico, the band into which Geronimo was born. The Nedjes, sometimes called the Southern Chiricahua, whose country ran deep into the Sierra Madre of Mexico. The Warm Springs people, the Chihenne, who lived further east, near what settlers would call the Black Range of New Mexico, and whose leaders would include Mangus Coloradas, arguably the most significant Apache political figure of his generation. These were not interchangeable. A leader's authority was real, but it was not absolute, and it did not extend automatically over other bands or even over every family within his own. A man followed a particular leader because he trusted that leader's judgment. If that judgment failed, or if a leader's path conflicted with a family's survival, the family could, and sometimes did, make different choices. This matters enormously for understanding the conflict that came later, because American military and government officials repeatedly made treaties with one leader, and then expected those terms to bind people who had never agreed to them, and whose own leaders had reached entirely different conclusions. The political structure the United States tried to impose on the Apache was a structure the Apache did not have and had never needed. What they had instead was something more flexible and, for a people living in that country, more effective: seasonal mobility. The Chiricahua bands moved with the seasons, dropping down to lower elevations in winter where the cold was less severe, climbing into the mountains in summer where the heat was bearable and the mescal agave could be harvested. They raided into northern Mexico in cycles that had their own rhythm and their own logic, acquiring horses, cattle, goods, and sometimes captives in a pattern that long predated American involvement in the region. The Mexican states of Sonora and Chihuahua had been at war with the Apache, intermittently and sometimes formally, for well over a century before the United States Army arrived in the Southwest after the Mexican-American War of 1846 to 1848. That history mattered. It shaped what the Apache expected from any organized government with an army behind it. It shaped their calculations about negotiation and trust. It was not a blank slate that American policy arrived to write on. It was a ledger already full of entries, many of them written in blood. The border that the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo drew across this country in 1848, and that the Gadsden Purchase adjusted slightly southward in 1853, meant almost nothing to Apache families whose seasonal movements had always crossed what would become the line between the United States and Mexico. The Nedni Band's home territory was south of that line. The Chokanen territory crossed it. A family gathering plants in the Peloncillo foothills had no reason to consult a treaty negotiated in distant capitals when deciding where to camp. They followed the water, they followed the food, they followed the routes their grandparents had used. The border was an American and Mexican legal concept. It was not a fact of the landscape. This is why, when American officials later tried to confine Apache bands to specific reservations, the confinement was not simply a loss of land in the sense of acreage or property. It was the severing of an entire system of survival. A system that required movement, that required access to multiple elevations and multiple water sources across hundreds of miles, that required the ability to cross into Mexico when conditions in Arizona deteriorated, and to return when they improved. To take that mobility away was to take away the mechanism by which families fed themselves, protected themselves, and maintained the social connections that held the band together. It was not a land transaction. It was closer to the removal of the conditions that made life possible. That is the baseline from which everything in this story should be understood. Not a romantic idea of freedom in the mountains, though the mountains were real and the freedom was real. A practical, highly specific, deeply intelligent adaptation to one of the most demanding landscapes in North America. A system refined over generations. A system that required the mountains to remain accessible, the water sources to remain open, the seasonal routes to remain unobstructed, and a system that the expansion of the United States into the Southwest was going to place under direct, relentless, and eventually lethal pressure. The Apache did not go to war because they were wild or because violence was their nature. They went to war, eventually, because the alternative was to watch everything that made survival possible disappear piece by piece, agreement by agreement, until there was nothing left. To understand why that war started when it did, and why it started where it did, you have to go to a specific place, a narrow cut in the rock between the Dos Cabezas Mountains and the Chiricahua Mountains, where a spring ran clear and cold in otherwise waterless country. A place the Spanish had known, that the Apache had always known, and that the United States suddenly needed very badly in the 1850s. Apache Pass. Apache Pass is not dramatic to look at, not at first. It does not announce itself the way a mountain summit does, or the way a river canyon does. It is a gap roughly 1.5 miles wide at its narrowest point, sitting at about 5,000 feet elevation between the Dos Cabezas Mountains to the north and the Chiricahua Mountains to the south. From a distance, in the right light, you might miss it, and that quality, the way it sits quietly in the landscape without making a fuss about itself, is almost exactly why it mattered as much as it did. The basin country on either side of the Dos Cabezas and Chiricahua ranges in southeastern Arizona is not country where people moved casually. It is hot, it is flat, it is exposed, and in the months that counted most for travel, the summer months, when freight wagons and military columns and mail riders needed to move across the southwest, it offered almost nothing in the way of water. The San Simon Valley to the east of the pass, the Sulphur Springs Valley to the west, both of them long and wide and empty in the way that desert basins are empty, where you can see 20 miles in every direction, and none of what you see is a reliable spring. Movement across that country without water was not a hardship. It was a death sentence. The spring inside Apache Pass changed the equation. It ran out of the rock on the south wall of the pass, cold and reliable in a country where reliable water was the rarest thing there was. The Apache had known it for as long as the Chiricahua had moved through this country. It sat at the right elevation for a camp, sheltered by the canyon walls from the worst of the desert wind, positioned so that anyone moving between the Rio Grande to the east and the settled Mexican towns to the west more or less had to pass within range of it. You could choose a different route, but that choice carried costs. The spring in the pass was not one option among many. It was the option. When the United States acquired this part of the Southwest through the Gadsden Purchase of 1853, the country that became southern Arizona and southern New Mexico was not empty space on a map waiting to be organized. It was land with a logic already written into it by the people who had used it for generations. That logic ran through Apache Pass. The Butterfield Overland Mail Route, which began operation in 1858 and connected St. Louis to San Francisco across nearly 3,000 miles of often punishing country, had to find water. The surveyors who laid the route out did what anyone intelligent enough to survive in that country eventually did. They followed the paths that already existed. The Butterfield route went through Apache Pass. It had to. There was nowhere else to go. The stage station the Butterfield Company built at the Spring in 1858 was a practical acknowledgement of the same geography the Apache had always understood. Stone walls, a relay point for fresh horses, a place where a rider or a passenger could stop and drink before pushing west toward Tucson or east toward the Rio Grande. For about 2 years, the station operated with something that contemporary accounts describe as a rough accommodation with the Chiricahua Apache who lived in and around the pass. Cochise, the Choctaw leader whose territory encompassed this ground, had dealings with the Butterfield employees that some accounts describe as civil, even cooperative. There was woodcutting done in the area. There was trade. The picture is incomplete and it should not be romanticized, but it was not open war. Not yet. What the pass represented, though, was not simply a mail route or a water stop. It was a choke point in the fullest military and strategic sense of that word. Anyone who wanted to move significant numbers of men, animals, and supplies across the southern part of the territory had to account for Apache Pass one way or another. The Chiricahua Apache understood this in the same way that any people with deep knowledge of their home terrain understand where the leverage points are. The pass was not just where they got water. It was where they could see everything coming from either direction. where the canyon walls gave the advantage to whoever held the high ground, where a relatively small number of fighters who knew the rocks could make life extraordinarily difficult for a much larger force moving through the open floor of the cut. The pass was a position, and the Chiricahua had been occupying that position, in every practical sense, for generations. The collision that was coming was not only about the spring, though the spring was always at the center of it. It was about what the pass represented for two very different systems of organizing space. For the United States Army and the government behind it, Apache Pass was a corridor, a necessary link in a chain of communication and supply that needed to be secured, kept open, made predictable. For the Chiricahua, it was something closer to the reverse. It was a place where they held an advantage, where the land itself worked in their favor, where their knowledge of every approach and every hiding place gave them options that no outside force could easily neutralize. To control Apache Pass was to control movement through a wide swath of the Southwest. Both sides understood that, each in their own terms. The military significance would become brutally clear in 1862, when the Battle of Apache Pass forced the United States to recognize that an informal presence in the region was not going to be enough. That engagement, which we will come to, led directly to the construction of Fort Bowie at the mouth of the pass, and Fort Bowie would become the central hub of U.S. military operations against the Chiricahua Apache for the quarter century. Every campaign, every pursuit, every negotiation conducted under the pressure of armed force traced back in some way to that fortified presence at the spring. The Army had learned the same lesson about water that the Apache had always known, and then it had built walls around it. But before the battle, before the fort, there was an incident, a confrontation that did not have to happen the way it happened. A young Army lieutenant who may have been following orders and may have been acting on assumptions that nobody had thought carefully enough about. A misunderstanding or a betrayal, depending on which account you believe, and there are accounts that pull in different directions, as there usually are when the event that follows is catastrophic. A man named Cochise came to a meeting under what he believed were the terms of a safe conversation. What happened next would set the entire region on fire. And to understand why that moment broke the way it did, you have to understand what it cost to lose access to Apache Pass. What it meant to have a spring that your family had used for generations suddenly become a fortified position, held by an army that did not trust you, and that you had learned, through experience too recent to have been forgotten, could not simply be trusted in return. The pass was the place where everything converged. The geography and the military need and the Apache knowledge of the land and the American certainty that what they needed they were entitled to take. It was the kind of place where history does not drift into violence gradually. It arrives there all at once, and it happened there, in that gap between the mountains, in February of 1861, at the very place that had already begun to feel like a lever on the entire region. Apache Pass, the spring, the station, a narrow corridor where a conversation could be as dangerous as a gunshot. If the wrong assumptions were carried into it, the immediate trigger was not the pass itself. It was a raid and an abduction that took place miles away. A rancher named John Ward, living near what Americans called Sonora Creek, reported that cattle had been taken and that a boy had been carried off. The boy's name was Felix Ward, a teenager, and he was also known as Mickey Free, a name that would follow him into a very different life later on. In the way frontier communities often worked, a single incident became a crisis that demanded an answer now, not after careful investigation. And the Army, which was still trying to establish authority in a new territory and keep a mail route open, felt pressure to produce that answer. A young officer, Lieutenant George Bascom, was sent out with orders that were direct enough to be dangerous. Find the responsible party. Recover the boy. Recover the stock. Make it stop. Bascom was 25. He was not an old Indian fighter with years of hard experience in the Apache country. He was a professional soldier, trained in a system that assumed negotiations were backed by force and that force could be applied cleanly. In the Southwest, it almost never was. Bascom's problem, before he even met Cochise, was that the people who had taken Ward's cattle and the boy were almost certainly not the people Bascom was about to accuse. Most historians today identify the raiders as a Western Apache group, often named as Pinal or Aravaipa, not Cochise's Chokanen Chiricahua. But on the American side, in early 1861, Apache was often treated as a single label, a single enemy, as if bands separated by mountain ranges and hundreds of miles answered to one chief. The distinctions mattered intensely to the Apache. Bascom either did not know them or did not treat them as decisive. Cochise, for his part, was not an unknown figure. He had been dealing, in limited ways, with the Butterfield people at Apache Pass. There had been arrangements, fragile ones, but arrangements. So when Bascom arrived at the station and sent word that he wanted to talk, Cochise came. He came in the way a leader comes when he believes a meeting is a meeting. He did not come with a war party. Accounts differ on the exact number, but the core fact does not. Cochise entered the station with a small group that included family members. He sat down. He listened to what the lieutenant had to say. Bascom told him he was there for the boy and the cattle. He told him he knew Cochise had them. He told him, in effect, that the meeting was not a discussion. It was an arrest. And this is where the entire thing pivoted, because from Bascom's perspective, he had a problem, and Cochise was the man in front of him with authority in the region. If Cochise wanted peace, he could produce the captive and return the stock. If he did not, then he would be held responsible. That is how chain of command thinking works. But Cochise did not operate inside Bascom's chain of command. He did not have Felix Ward. He likely did not know where he was, and when he said so, Bascom did not hear it as truth. He heard it as denial. Cochise offered what, in his world, would have been a reasonable counter. He said he would try to find the boy. He would send messengers. He would work to recover what had been taken. But Bascom had already decided that the only guarantee was leverage. He gave a signal. Soldiers moved. And Cochise realized, in that moment, that he had been lured into a trap. There are different versions of what happened next, but they all carry the same shape. Cochise cut his way out. Some say he drew a knife and slashed through the tent wall. Some say he fought hand to hand. Either way, he escaped the station and disappeared into the rocks of the pass. The soldiers fired after him, and he was wounded, but he got away. He got away with the message burned into him as clearly as if it had been branded. The Americans would call you to talk and then try to take you. Bascom did not come away empty-handed, though. In the scramble, Cochise's companions did not all escape. Several were detained, including close relatives. Bascom now had hostages, and in his mind hostages solved the problem. He would hold them until Cochise returned with Felix Ward and the stolen cattle. That was the leverage. That was the plan. Cochise answered in the only currency that could reach Bascom immediately. He took hostages of his own. He captured stage employees and travelers in the region around the pass. Men who were suddenly not individuals but counters in a grim exchange. The affair became a hostage crisis in a landscape where the distance between camps and the time it took for messages to travel made misunderstandings lethal. Negotiations began, and they broke, and they began again. There were meetings under flags of truce, tense and narrow, and full of the kind of silence where every man is watching the other man's hands. Cochise offered exchanges. Bascom demanded the boy first. Cochise insisted he could not produce what he did not have. Bascom insisted that he could. Trust, which had been thin to begin with, did not merely erode. It snapped, and once it snapped, every action became proof of what the other side had suspected all along. From the American viewpoint, Cochise was stalling while holding innocent captives. From the Chiricahua viewpoint, Bascom had kidnapped Cochise's family under a lie. The meeting itself had become the crime. It was not simply that Bascom thought Cochise was responsible for a raid. It was that Bascom had turned a talk into an attempted seizure. In a world where safe passage and safe speech were the difference between war and coexistence, that mattered. The hostage exchange did not happen. The boy did not appear because Cochise could not make him appear. The standoff dragged on, and in the end, Bascom did what officers sometimes do when they feel they are losing control of a situation. He escalated. He ordered executions of the Apache captives he held. They were hanged. Cochise, in return, killed some of the captives he had taken. The exact sequence and the exact numbers vary across accounts, and later writers sometimes smoothed the story into something simpler than it was, but the outcome is not in dispute. Blood had been put into the ground on both sides. The affair ended not with an agreement, but with a wound. It is tempting, especially in the way American popular history likes to package frontier violence, to describe this as a tragic misunderstanding. Two sides talking past each other, a young lieutenant making a mistake, a proud leader reacting with anger. But the truth is harder, because the misunderstanding, if that is what it was, revealed something real underneath. It revealed how quickly the United States military system defaulted to coercion when it did not understand local politics. And it revealed how quickly the Chiricahua concluded that American promises could not be separated from American force. This is why the Bascom Affair is remembered as more than an isolated incident, because it did not stay contained. It did not remain a personal feud between Bascom and Cochise. It spread outward into the country itself, into the canyon trails, into the mail route, into the ranches and the wood-cutting camps and the small exposed stations that existed only because the pass existed. The National Park Service, looking back across what followed, identifies the Bascom Affair as a spark for war with the Apaches that lasted until 1872. A spark is not the same thing as a cause. The causes were older and larger. Land pressure, travel corridors, the taking of water, the collapse of agreements, the assumption that one side could impose order and the other side would accept it. But sparks matter. They are the moment when the larger pressures find a point of ignition. After February 1861, Cochise did not treat the station at Apache Pass as a place where cautious accommodation might still be possible. It became a symbol, a place where a leader came to speak and was met with an ambush. And on the American side, Cochise was now fixed in the imagination as a man who could not be reasoned with, a man who took hostages and killed them. The nuance that he had not taken Felix Ward in the first place did not matter much in the counties and the newspapers and the officer reports. The category had been created. Enemy mistrust hardened fast. It hardened in the way it always does on frontiers where both sides feel endangered and both sides believe the other side is lying. Every new raid became proof. Every new patrol became a provocation. Every attempt to negotiate carried the memory of a meeting that had turned into handcuffs, and from here the story widens. Because Cochise was not alone in the Chiricahua world, and the Americans were not dealing with one band in one pass. Other leaders would enter the story. Other bands with their own grievances and their own calculations. Men like Mangus Coloradas, older, respected, already marked by years of conflict with Mexicans and Americans alike. The Bascom Affair did not create the Apache Wars by itself, but it changed the temperature of everything that came after. It made war easier to choose and peace harder to trust, and once that choice set in, Apache Pass stopped being merely a strategic choke point. It became a battlefield waiting for an army to arrive. When people say the Apache Wars, they often say it as if it was one long, single conflict with a single chain of command and a single set of motives. But the war that flared after Bascom was not a unified uprising. It was a widening fracture line. Different Chiricahua bands, Choctanen, Chihan, Betancohe, Nedni, had their own leaders, their own home ranges, their own alliances and rivalries, and their own memory of what had been done to them by Mexicans, by Americans, by miners, by soldiers, by settlers, by the constant traffic cutting through their country. What Bascom did at Apache Pass mattered because it reached into those memories and confirmed the most dangerous suspicion in the Southwest. That when an American officer said, "talk," he might mean trap. That a flag of truce might still end with a rope. That your relatives could be taken because someone somewhere else had stolen cattle. Once that belief settles in, it changes the logic of everything. It turns negotiation into risk. It turns restraint into weakness. And it makes retaliation feel like the only language that cannot be translated wrong. Cochise was at the center of that shift for the Chokanen Chiricahua, the people most closely tied to Apache Pass itself. He was a leader with deep local authority, a man who knew every fold of the Dos Cabezas and the Dragoon Mountains, every water source and hidden trail. Americans would later describe him as if he were a lone war chief, a kind of southwestern version of a plains leader. But Cochise's strength was not that he ruled the Apache. It was that he was rooted. He belonged to a specific country and a specific network of families who could move through it like it was a map they carried under the skin. And then there was Mangas Coloradas. If Cochise was the leader whose name became tied to Apache Pass, Mangas Coloradas was something older and broader, especially among the Chihan, the Warm Springs people. Based farther east and north, in what is now New Mexico, Mangas had been dealing with outsiders long before Bascom ever set foot in the territory. His life stretched back into the era when Mexican troops rode out of Sonora and Chihuahua to hunt Apaches for bounties, and when peace too often meant a thin promise on paper and an ambush in practice. Some accounts say Mangas had been flogged by miners near Pinos Altos. The details are argued and filtered through memory, but the outline is clear enough. He carried scars, literal and political, from earlier contact. He did not need Bascom to teach him what betrayal looked like, but Bascom gave him a new example, and it involved a man Mangas treated as kin and ally. Cochise and Mangas were not the same kind of leader, and they did not represent the same people, but they could act together when their interests aligned. And after Bascom, those interests did align, because the issue was no longer one raid or one kidnapped boy. It was the question of whether Chiricahua families could exist in their own homeland without being treated as criminals in advance. Whether an American mail route would become a knife laid across the throat of the mountains. Whether soldiers and civilians would keep pushing into the springs and passes and timber stands that mattered most. So the conflict broadened, raids became more frequent, and reprisals became more brutal, and the war zone began to stretch like a stain across southern Arizona and into New Mexico. It was not confined to one pass. It moved along the routes people depended on. The stage lines, the wagon roads, the places where woodcutters worked, the isolated ranches, the small stations where a handful of men lived with their backs to the desert. These were not forts, they were targets. And every time a station burned or a teamster was killed, the pressure rose for the army to strike back harder, to punish, to make examples, to prove control. But control was exactly what the terrain did not allow. This is one of the hardest things for modern audiences to fully feel. Southern Arizona is not empty space. It is structured space. It is a country of mountain islands and desert basins, of narrow canyons and sudden ridgelines, where a person who knows the land can disappear in a way that feels almost supernatural to someone who does not. The Chiricahua did not melt away because they were ghosts. They melted away because they were home. They had mobility that did not depend on wagons or supply trains. They carried less. They moved faster. They could split into small groups and reunite days later at a spring you would miss unless someone showed it to you. They could read sign in dry ground the way other people read print. Broken grass, a turned stone, a faint scuff on caliche that tells you not just that someone passed, but how long ago, and how many, and whether they were tired or running, and they did not operate alone. No raiding society does. People on the outside often imagine Apache war parties as isolated bands living off the land with no support. But the reality was more human and more complicated. The Chiricahua had support networks, family ties, friendly camps, trade relationships, information moving from one place to another. Sometimes that support came from other Apache groups. Sometimes it came from Mexicans in the borderlands who were entangled in the same economy of fear and opportunity. Sometimes it came from people who simply wanted the war to pass them by and made choices they could live with. The border itself was not a wall. It was a line on paper laid over a landscape that people had crossed for generations. The U.S. Army, by contrast, moved like an institution. It moved with orders, with columns, with mules, with rations, with the burden of its own system. A cavalry troop could ride hard, but it still needed water, it still needed forage, it still needed information. And in this country, information was as scarce as shade. Soldiers chased tracks that vanished into rock. They followed trails into canyons where one rifle behind a boulder could halt an entire advance. They marched into ranges where the enemy did not have to win a battle to win the day. The enemy only had to not be caught. So the war took on a particular shape. Mountain warfare, hit and run fighting, ambush and counter-ambush, brief violence and long pursuit. And it created a cycle that was almost impossible to break once it gained momentum. A Chiricahua party raids livestock or attacks a station. Settlers demand protection. The Army responds. The Army's response, often blind to the distinctions between bands, strikes a camp or seizes property or kills people who may or may not have been involved. That response creates new grief and new obligation and new rage. Another raid answers it. Another patrol answers that. The violence begins to feed itself. It is important to say, plainly, what this was and what it was not. It was not random. It was not senseless bloodlust roaming the desert. It was conflict tied to land, pressure, and survival. The Chiricahua were fighting in a moment when their country was being threaded by roads and stations and mining camps, when water and grass, always the real currency of the Southwest, were being claimed and fenced and guarded. The Americans were fighting in a moment when they believed the territory had to be made safe for movement and settlement, and when any armed resistance could be labeled depredation and treated as a criminal problem instead of a political one. Cochise and Mangas Coloradas understood, in their different ways, that the Americans were not going to stop at the edges of the pass. They were going to keep coming. The Butterfield Station was not the end. It was the beginning. And after Bascom, the possibility that coexistence could be negotiated on equal terms felt, to many Chiricahua, like a story you told yourself right before you lost everything. For the American officers who would soon enter this story in larger numbers, it could look like chaos. Scattered raids, sudden attacks, a war without a front line. But from the Chiricahua side, it had a grim logic. Protect the home ranges. Punish betrayal. Take what you need to keep families alive. Keep the enemy uncertain. Never give him the set-piece battle he wants. Because the set-piece battle is where the Army's numbers and artillery and discipline matter most. This is how the Bascom Affair becomes something more than a single incident. It becomes the hinge on which the relationship swings from tense coexistence to open war. Not because every Chiricahua leader agreed on every action. They did not. Not because every Apache group joined the fight. They did not. But because the center could not hold. The ground of trust collapsed, and once it collapsed, men like Cochise and Mangas Coloradas were not merely reacting. They were making a calculation about the future. And the future they saw was an army coming through a pass that controlled the springs. That is why what happens next is almost inevitable, because the United States would not abandon Apache Pass. And Cochise and Mangas could not allow it to become a permanent doorway into their world without a fight. So the pass that had been a corridor became a battleground, and the war that had been a series of sparks in scattered places began to take the shape of a campaign. In July of 1862, The United States Army came to Apache Pass in numbers and with a purpose that went beyond any one raid or any one grudge. This was the Civil War era, and the column moving through southern Arizona was not just policing. It was trying to keep the West connected to the Union, to secure a corridor, to deny space to Confederate influence, and to move men and supplies across a country that did not care about politics. The soldiers called it the California Column. The land called it thirst. Apache Pass was not important because it was dramatic. It was important because it had water. Between the Dos Cabezas and the Chiricahua Mountains, the pass held springs that were reliable in a way desert water rarely is. In a basin and range world, those springs were a lever. Control them and you can move. Lose them and you stop. And stopping in that country, in July, with animals and wagons and men already worn down by heat, was not a pause. It was a crisis. Cochise knew that. Mangas Coloradas knew it. And they knew something else, too. If a large American force could march through the pass, drink at will, and keep going, then the pass would stop being a dangerous place, outsiders, crossed quickly, and start becoming a permanent doorway. A place that would be guarded. A place that would be measured and mapped. A place where soldiers might soon sleep in shifts beside the water, so the Chiricahua chose to contest it. Sources differ on exact numbers, and the fog of war is thick in almost every retelling, but the outline is widely accepted. Cochise and Mangas Coloradas, key Chiricahua leaders, were involved in the fighting at Apache Pass that month. Their bands did what Apache fighters had learned to do over generations of borderland warfare. They did not line up in the open. They occupied the high ground. They used rock and distance and angles. They turned the pass itself into a weapon. For the Army, the approach into Apache Pass was a funnel. The walls rise. The ground narrows. The noise of your own movement tells on you. A command can be stretched out along the trail, with the front seeing one world and the rear seeing another. Every officer who had marched in the Southwest learned to fear that kind of terrain, because it let a small force hit a large one without ever offering a clear target in return. When the shooting started, it followed the logic of the country. Apache fighters fired from ridges and boulders, from positions that were chosen because they could not be easily rushed without exposing yourself. The purpose was not necessarily to annihilate the column. It was to slow it, confuse it, force it to burn ammunition and time and nerve, and above all, to keep it from the springs. Because if you can keep a soldier away from water long enough, the desert will do what bullets do not have to. This is where Apache Pass becomes more than a skirmish in a list. It becomes a kind of meeting point between two ways of war. On one side were men like Cochise and Mangas Coloradas, whose power rested in mobility, local knowledge, and the ability to make a landscape hostile to an invader. They had strengths that did not show up on a muster roll. They could move without supply lines. They could break contact and vanish. They could choose when the fight happened and when it did not. And they could make the enemy feel watched at every step, because in their country, he was. On the other side was the United States Army, which carried its own strength in a different form. It was slow, yes. It was burdened, yes. But it was persistent. It could replace losses. It could keep coming back. It could build. It could bring artillery into places where a few decades earlier, no one would have imagined dragging guns at all. At Apache Pass in July 1862. That difference mattered because the Army did not only bring rifles. It brought howitzers. If you want to understand why this battle became a turning point, you do not have to romanticize anything. You just have to imagine what it means, in a narrow mountain pass, to be used to trading shots across stone and distance, and then to hear an explosive shell burst against rock. A rifle demands a target. A shell punishes a position. The howitzers could reach into cover. They could make the ridgeline unsafe in a way that disciplined volley fire often could not. Accounts from the Army side emphasize how decisive those guns felt, and it is possible that later memory sharpened the story into something cleaner than it really was. But the core point holds. The artillery changed the terms. It did not erase Apache skill. It did not suddenly make the pass easy. But it gave the column a tool that did not require seeing an enemy clearly to make him move. And when the Apache fighters gave ground, even temporarily, the springs came within reach. That was the stakes in its simplest form: water and access. Not glory, not conquest in the way people picture conquest. A few wet places in a long, dry corridor that could decide whether an army crossed the territory or died trying. There is an old habit in American storytelling that treats battles like Apache Pass as if they were tests of courage, with one side standing and one side breaking. That is not really what happened here. The Chiricahua did not need to hold the pass forever to prove anything. They needed to deny it, to make it costly, to send a message that the corridor could not be used without consequences. The army did not need to destroy Cochise or Mongas in a single day. It needed to get through. It needed to drink. It needed to keep moving, so the battle becomes a lesson to both sides. For the army, Apache Pass showed that Chiricahua resistance was not just raiding. It could be organized. It could concentrate at a choke point. It could exploit terrain with a professionalism that made a marching column feel clumsy and exposed. Officers who had thought of the Apache as scattered thieves learned, in a very direct way, that they were facing a people who understood tactical ground as well as any light infantry. For Cochise and Mangas Coloradas, the same fight showed something equally important and more ominous. The Americans were not just travelers anymore. They were an occupying power in motion. They were willing to bring heavy weapons into the mountains. They were willing to fight for a spring. And they were not going to stop coming just because the country was hard. This is the part Hollywood almost never sits with. The battle did not settle Apache Pass. It advertised it. Once the army had fought through and understood what the pass meant, the militarization that followed was almost automatic. An army that depends on movement depends on nodes. Springs become nodes. Passes become nodes. And nodes become forts. Apache Pass, after July 1862, could not go back to being merely a dangerous crossing. It had been identified in blood and powder smoke as a strategic necessity. The logic of American expansion in the Southwest was beginning to harden from a series of routes into a system of control. Not control of every canyon and ridge, that would always be impossible, but control of the places where travel had to concentrate, the places where water forced you to show yourself. And that is why the Battle of Apache Pass is remembered as a turning point, not because the Chiricahua suddenly stopped fighting. They did not. Not because the army suddenly mastered mountain war. It did not. But because both sides saw, with unusual clarity, what the future was going to look like if neither yielded. A future where the U.S. Army would answer ambush with fortification, where it would answer mobility with roads and posts and patrol patterns, where it would try to turn an Apache homeland into a monitored corridor, and in the center of it sat the springs, still flowing, indifferent. The pass had been a corridor. Now it was a problem the army intended to solve permanently. And for Cochise and Mangas Coloradas, it was a warning that the doorway into their world was about to be nailed open and guarded. The army did not have to invent the solution. The solution had been used on frontiers for centuries. If a place controls movement, you put men there. If water forces the traveler to slow down, you build at the water. If the land funnels your enemy into a narrow corridor, you nail your presence into the mouth of that corridor and you refuse to leave. That is what Fort Bowie was. In the months after the fighting at Apache Pass, the United States Army established a post near the springs, in the shadow of the same ridges where Cochise and Mangas Coloradas had placed their fighters. At first, it was rough, a wartime expedient. A garrison set down because the California Column and every force that followed it had learned the same lesson. You could not treat Apache Pass like a place you merely crossed. Not anymore. You had to hold it, or you would keep paying for it. Fort Bowie's purpose was not subtle. It existed to secure the pass, to protect the road, and to keep open a line of movement across southern Arizona that the Army had decided it could not afford to lose. It was also meant to do something more psychologically important. It was meant to tell the Chiricahua and everyone else watching that this was not a raid and not a temporary expedition. This was a stake driven into the ground. That is why Fort Bowie becomes one of the central characters of the Apache Wars, even though it does not have the romance of a single famous battle attached to it. Because for over 20 years, Fort Bowie was a focal point of U.S. Army actions against the Chiricahua Apaches, not in the sense that every fight happened at its walls, but in the sense that so much of the military pressure in that part of the Southwest radiated from it. Patrols went out from Bowie. Scouts reported back to Bowie. Prisoners were brought through Bowie. Supplies moved through Bowie. Orders arrived at Bowie and then became movement on the ground. In Hollywood, war is a series of climaxes. In the real borderlands, war is often a system. Fort Bowie was a system. It sat at a hinge point between mountain ranges, anchored to the springs at Apache Pass like a lock on a gate. And once the Army had a lock, it could begin to build the rest of the door. Roads were improved. Routes were standardized. The mail line became more reliable. Freight wagons began to move with a kind of regularity that had been impossible when the pass was a place you entered with dread and exited with relief. This is the part that can sound boring if you say it wrong, so let's say it plainly. Roads and supply lines are not background details. They are weapons. A people like the Chiricahua did not need a warehouse to fight. They needed knowledge of country, kin networks, and the ability to move. They had always relied on speed, on dispersal, on the fact that an enemy tied to wagons and forage and water barrels could be made to feel slow and blind. But a fort changes the math. A fort gives an army a place to store food and ammunition. A fort gives you fresh mounts, blacksmithing, repairs. A fort gives you endurance. A mobile force can win a fight. A fortified force can keep coming back until the fight stops happening on your terms. And that was the deeper meaning of Fort Bowie. Not that it made the Chiricahua helpless. It did not. Not that it ended raiding. It did not. But it changed the rhythm of the war. It made the Army less dependent on luck and more dependent on routine. It helped turn a contest of surprise into a contest of persistence. Think about what the pass had been before. A place where a band could watch from the rocks and decide when the traveler would be allowed to drink. Fort Bowie was the opposite of that. It was a claim that the springs would be watched all the time. That if you came near, someone would see you, or someone would ride for someone who could. The fort also mattered because it began to pull the surrounding country into an American grid. From a post like Bowie, the Army could map. It could measure distances in a way that becomes deadly practical. How many hours to the next water? How many miles a horse can be pushed before it breaks? Where the trails cut through the hills? Which canyons hide sign? Which ridges offer fields of fire? What had been local knowledge, held in the bodies and memories of Apache families, started to be copied into reports and passed along to officers who had never lived there. We should not pretend that paper turned soldiers into mountain people overnight. Chiricahua warriors still had the advantage of home ground, and they continued to prove it again and again. But the Army was learning, and a fort is a school as much as it is a fortress. Men rotated through it. They heard the same warnings. They learned which trails not to trust. They learned what it meant when a camp was cold, when a track turned suddenly, when a ridge went quiet. The other transformation was surveillance. A fort is not only walls, it is eyes. It is a place where scouts can be recruited, questioned, paid, and sent out again. It is where interpreters become valuable. It is where rumor turns into actionable information, sometimes accurate, sometimes disastrously wrong. It is where a commander can sit with a map and begin to think in patterns. patterns of raids, patterns of movement, patterns of hiding places. And once an occupying force begins to think in patterns, it begins to shift from chasing shadows to trying to deny options. That is the point where the frontier stops being a line and becomes a net. From Fort Bowie, the Army could support other posts, coordinate movements, and keep pressure on the Chiricahua homeland in a way that sporadic expeditions never could. Soldiers could ride out, fail to catch anyone, and still return to a stocked position instead of retreating all the way back to some distant base. That matters more than it sounds like it should. It means failure no longer ends the campaign. It just ends the day. Fort Bowie also carried a message that Apache leaders understood immediately because they had seen versions of it before, from other powers, in other decades. The message was permanence. A raiding party comes and goes. A trading caravan comes and goes. Even a punitive expedition comes and goes. But a fort is the opposite of going. It is the statement, made in timber and stone and daily routine, that the outsiders intend to stay. That they intend to make the doorway into your country a guarded doorway forever. For Cochise and the Chiricahua bands around him, this was not just a military annoyance. It was a tightening, a narrowing of space. It meant that travel through Apache Pass could no longer be managed solely by intimidation and ambush. It meant contact would increase. More miners, more ranchers, more stage traffic, more small violences and misunderstandings that did not make it into official reports but accumulated anyway. And behind all of it was that post at the Springs, turning one of the most important pieces of geography in the region into an American instrument. If you want to understand how the balance of power shifts in the Apache Wars, you have to look less at the cinematic gunfights and more at the infrastructure of pursuit. Fort Bowie was a machine built to keep pressure on. It did not need to win a single decisive battle. It needed to exist through summers and winters, through changes of commanders, through changing headlines back east. It needed to make the Army's presence feel like weather. And it did. But permanence creates its own problems. The more the Army tied itself to posts and roads and supply schedules, the more predictable it could become. The Chiricahua did not lose the ability to strike. They adapted. They watched the routines. They learned which patrols were sloppy and which were careful. They learned how to move around the edges of that net, how to hit an outlying wagon train or a lonely camp, and then disappear back into broken country where a fort's authority became thin. So Fort Bowie did not end the war. It escalated the logic of it. It made Apache Pass a militarized corridor. It made the conflict less about single encounters and more about an ongoing contest between mobility and occupation, between a people trying to remain unpinned and a government trying to turn the landscape into something that could be administered. And that is why this post, sitting at a spring in a narrow pass, becomes so important to what comes next. Because once the fort is there, the war is no longer only about what happens when two groups meet on a trail. It becomes about whether the Chiricahua can live with a permanent garrison in the doorway of their homeland, and whether the United States will ever accept anything less than that doorway staying open. A doorway staying open sounds like a policy. On the ground, it felt like a daily provocation, because every wagon that rolled through Apache Pass was not just freight. It was a claim. Every new cut in a roadbed was not just labor. It was a promise that more people would come. And every patrol that rode out from Fort Bowie was not just looking for tracks. It was telling the Chiricahua that the old distance between their country and our country was being erased 1 mile at a time. So the years after Fort Bowie were not a straight line toward peace. They were a long strain of war and negotiation and exhaustion, punctuated by sudden violence and then sudden silence, and then violence again. Cochise was still there. He had not stopped being a strategist. He had not stopped being a husband and a father and a man responsible for a web of families who depended on his judgment. But the world around him was shifting. More soldiers, more miners, More ranchers, more stage stations, more men who did not know the old rules of the borderlands and did not care to learn them. And underneath all of it, the same pressure that shows up in every Western story when you strip the romance away: land, water, movement. Who gets to be where, and who gets told they no longer can? In the Chiricahua homeland, that question did not have an abstract answer. It had a geographic one: the Dragoon Mountains, the Chiricahua Mountains. The steep cuts and hidden springs where a small group could vanish and then reappear days later somewhere else entirely. The war was fought in those folds. Not because the Chiricahua loved war, but because the land made survival possible there in a way it did not on open ground. The army learned the same lesson again and again. A column could march. It could burn a camp. It could kill horses. It could take food. And then the people it was trying to defeat would simply become a smaller target. They would disperse. They would move at night. They would go where a supply train could not follow. And weeks later, the raids would begin again. Not always as an act of pure aggression, but as the oldest kind of frontier economics. Take what you need. Replace what was taken from you. Punish the men who crossed a line. Make an enemy pay enough that he thinks twice before coming back. But the trouble was that more and more, the enemy did come back. By the late 1860s and early 1870s, even people who wanted the war to continue forever began to understand something that sounds simple and is still difficult to accept. You cannot occupy a land and also pretend you are not changing it. Every new settlement created the conditions for the next fight. And every fight created the conditions for a harsher kind of settlement. This is where the story begins to tilt toward negotiation, not because anyone suddenly became gentle, but because the cost of permanent war was becoming hard to deny. Soldiers died, settlers died, Apache families died, people were taken captive, herds vanished. Freight companies demanded protection, politicians demanded results, and in Washington, far from the dust and the canyon shadows, there was growing pressure for something that could be described as peace, even if it was a peace built out of restrictions. One of the men sent into that pressure cooker was General Oliver Otis Howard, known in the United States as O.O. Howard. Howard is not the kind of figure who fits neatly into the Hollywood version of the Apache Wars. He was a Union general, a man marked physically by the Civil War, and he carried a kind of moral seriousness that some people admired and others distrusted. He was also a federal official who believed, or at least tried to believe, that negotiation could be something other than a trick. In 1872, Howard went to meet Cochise, not through a grand ceremony, through hard travel and careful intermediaries, and the kind of cautious contact where everyone is armed, everyone is watching, and every word has to pass through translation and memory. It is a verified fact that in 1872, Cochise reached an armistice with General O.O. Howard. That armistice matters not because it ended the conflict across the Southwest. Nothing that small could do that, but because it shows what both sides had begun to recognize. That endless retaliation was not producing a winner. It was producing a cycle. Howard's approach was, for its time, unusual. He was willing to listen. He was willing to talk about boundaries. He was willing to consider, at least in principle, a reservation in the Chiricahua homeland, rather than insisting the Chiricahua be moved far away to a place where they would be weaker and easier to control. For Cochise, the question was never whether the United States had power. He knew it did. The question was whether a promise made by a general would survive the next general, the next agent, the next wave of settlers, the next newspaper story about a raid whose details would be debated and whose blame would be assigned to whichever Apache name was most convenient. Because that is what an armistice could not solve. It could not stop a miner from wandering into the wrong canyon and being killed, and then having his death turned into a cause. It could not stop a rancher from grazing cattle on a spring an Apache family depended on and calling it improvement. It could not prevent local militiamen from taking revenge on the wrong band. It could not make the borderlands stop being the borderlands, where rumor traveled faster than fact, and the punished were often not the guilty. An armistice also could not unify the Apache world into one decision. The Chiricahua were not a single unit taking orders like an army. They were bands and families with their own leaders and grievances and memories. Cochise had influence, deep influence, but influence is not the same thing as command. Some people wanted peace because they were tired, because their children were hungry, because they had buried too many. Others did not trust any paper peace and did not see why they should, especially if their own losses had never been answered for. So the 1872 armistice becomes something fragile by nature. It depended on trust. It depended on geography. And it depended on political restraint from people who were not used to restraint. Geography mattered because a promise without a place is only words. If the Chiricahua were to live, they needed space where they could still hunt, still move, still find water, still remain themselves. If the United States was to claim peace, it needed to be able to say where the Chiricahua belonged in a way that settlers would accept, and soldiers could enforce without constant fighting. Trust mattered because the Bascom Affair was not a distant story. It was living memory. Cochise did not forget how quickly a meeting could become a trap. Howard did not forget that a single misunderstanding could get everyone killed. And political restraint mattered because even if Cochise and Howard meant what they said, the region was full of men who did not. There were profits to be made in conflict. There were careers built on Indian fighting. There were local hatreds that did not consult Washington before acting. There was also the larger national habit of treating treaties as temporary obstacles to expansion, honored until they became inconvenient. So when we talk about peace efforts in this period, we have to say what that actually looked like. It looked like cautious visits. It looked like interpreters choosing words that could not fully match the original. It looked like the constant fear that one raid by one small party, maybe Chiricahua, maybe not, could collapse everything. And it looked like Fort Bowie still sitting at the spring, because even during negotiation, the United States did not remove the lock from the doorway. That is what makes the armistice so important and so unsettling at the same time. It was a pause, a breathing space, a chance for a different future. But it was not a cure. It did not change the fact that the frontier net was tightening. It did not change the fact that more outsiders would arrive next season than last season. It did not change the fact that the United States had a long-term plan for the land. And the Chiricahua had a long-term need to not be pushed off it. The settlement that formed out of 1872 rested on a narrow ridge of mutual self-control, and narrow ridges are dangerous places to stand. One slip, one act of revenge, one ambitious official, one frightened settler, one soldier who decides to interpret an order broadly, and the whole thing could slide. It held for a time, and that for a time is the key to what comes next. Because when peace depends on men who can be transferred, replaced, or ignored, peace is never only a handshake, it is a test. And the Apache Wars were about to show how easily those tests could be failed. It held for a time because one man was still there to hold it. Cochise had agreed to an armistice in 1872, and for the people who lived closest to the Chiricahua homeland, that agreement had a face, it had a voice. It had a name you could send a message to. It had an authority that did not come from a badge or a commission but from kinship, reputation, and the simple fact that he had survived long enough to be taken seriously. Then, in 1874, Cochise died. That is the hinge in this story. Not because the war ended. It did not. And not because the Chiricahua suddenly became someone else overnight. They did not. But because the kind of stability that had existed, fragile, negotiated, dependent on personal trust, lost its central weight. Hollywood likes to treat these moments like a curtain falling. The chief dies, the chapter closes, the credits roll. Real frontier conflict does not work that way. It is less like a duel and more like a pressure system. Remove one strong point and the weather does not stop. It changes direction. After Cochise, leadership did what leadership always does in a world made of bands and families. It shifted, it redistributed. It became more contested in the eyes of outsiders who wanted a single chief to sign away a people's future with one signature. Cochise's son Naishi would become an important figure in what followed, not as some mythical ruler of all Apaches, but as a Chiricahua leader carrying the weight of a famous name in a collapsing political landscape. Other men with their own followings and their own histories, people like Ju among the Nedni, and later Victorio among the Warm Springs Apache in the Black Range, were making decisions based on their own people's survival, not on any neat organizational chart the U.S. Army wished existed, and that is where the strategy changed. Cochise had been a war leader, but he had also been a diplomat when diplomacy could still buy something real. Space at home, a boundary that might hold, a chance for his people to live in their own mountains without being hunted like criminals. After 1874, the space for that kind of diplomacy narrowed. Part of it was personal. A new generation did not have Cochise's exact relationships with intermediaries. Trust, when it exists at all in war, is often attached to individuals. When those individuals die, the trust does not automatically transfer like a piece of property, but part of it was structural. The deeper crisis did not die with Cochise because it was never only about Cochise. It was about a federal system that measured peace by how still a people could be made. It was about settlers and mining interests and ranching interests pressing into the same limited geography of springs and grass and timber. It was about the idea, spoken openly by some, assumed quietly by others, that the future of the Southwest required Apache mobility to end. A reservation on paper could look like a compromise. In practice, it was an argument over movement, over hunting, over whether a family could leave to gather food without being labeled hostile, over whether a band could visit relatives without a pass, over whether the Army and the Indian agent would interpret a shortage of beef as a tragedy or as proof that the people were unfit to remain where they were. And those pressures did not arrive politely. They arrived as decisions. Agents could be replaced, policies could be rewritten, promises could be reconsidered. A general who had met Cochise could be reassigned, and a new officer could decide that the old understanding was inconvenient. Washington could talk about peace, while local commanders talked about control. Local newspapers could turn every theft into an outrage, and every outrage into a demand for removal. So the armistice that had been built on a narrow ridge of mutual self-control began to find its footing crumbling. For the Chiricahua, the question was not abstract. It was the daily math of survival. If you stay, will they starve you into submission? If you leave to hunt, will they call it a raid? If a young man steals a horse because he is hungry, because he is reckless, because he is angry, will the punishment fall only on him, or on everyone who shares his language and his mountains? And for the U.S. side, the question was also not abstract. If you allow a people to remain armed and mobile in their own country, do you have a reservation system at all? Or do you have a frontier you cannot fully command? This is why the conflict outlived individual leaders, because even when men on both sides were tired of killing, the underlying issues remained unresolved. Land, water, movement, authority, the right to stay, the power to make someone go, and in the years after Cochise's death, those unresolved issues did what they always do. They produced new fights with new names attached. Some Chiricahua tried to live within the tightening boundaries, to make the best of rations and regulations and the constant suspicion. Others left. Some left briefly and returned. Some left and did not return. And each departure, each rumor of a raid, each retaliatory expedition made the system harder and the language sharper. Hostile, renegade, outbreak. Words that made it easier to treat whole families as military problems. This is where the story begins to slide toward the later resistance that Americans most often associate with one name. Not Cochise, Geronimo. Geronimo was not a single chief figure over all Apaches. He was a Badanco and a Chiricahua religious figure and a war leader, a man whose influence came from reputation, spiritual authority, and endurance. And he would become inseparable from the last phase of the Apache Wars, not because he inherited Cochise's position, but because the world that had allowed Cochise to negotiate was closing. After Cochise, the question was no longer whether peace was possible in the Chiricahua homeland. It was whether the United States would allow it to be possible. And as the policy of removal hardened, and as the reservation system became less a refuge and more a trap, the mountains that had sheltered diplomacy began, once again, to shelter flight. The mountains that had sheltered diplomacy began to shelter flight because the reservation system, for many Chiricahua families, did not feel like peace. It felt like a fence that could move. A reservation was not only a place. It was a schedule, a ration line, a roll call, a rule book written in a language that did not carry the right words for kinship obligations, for mourning, for the need to go to a spring your grandparents had always used. It was a system that asked people who had survived by mobility to survive by permission. You could be told when you could leave, where you could hunt, who you could visit, whether you could carry a weapon, whether you could keep a horse. And the answer could change, depending on which agent was in charge, which officer had command, and which newspaper in Tucson or Santa Fe had decided that the Apache question needed a new solution, even when rations were issued honestly, and not all observers believed they always were. Rations were a kind of leverage. Beef could be late, flour could be cut, the promised tools could fail to appear. A man could be told to farm land that did not have enough water to farm. And then, when hunger did what hunger always does, the response could be punishment. The United States called this administration. The Chiricahua often experienced it as confinement. And confinement did not just mean a smaller map. It meant limited autonomy over the most intimate parts of life. It meant children growing up under armed supervision. It meant disputes inside the camp being judged from the outside. It meant the constant fear that one accusation, one stolen horse, one gunshot on a distant trail, could bring soldiers down on an entire cluster of families. This is where the language Americans used begins to matter. When a band left a reservation, the word was outbreak. When they returned, the word was submission. Those are military words. They flatten everything into obedience and defiance. But in the lived reality of Chiricahua life, leaving could mean something simpler and harder to explain in a telegram. It could mean finding food. It could mean escaping a quarrel that had turned deadly. It could mean taking your children away from a place where sickness had taken hold. It could mean not trusting the next order because the last order had already been broken. It could mean, in other words, survival rather than simple refusal. That survival had a method, and it was not random violence wandering the desert. Chiricahua Apache resistance relied on terrain knowledge, mobility, family protection, and cross-border movement between the United States and Mexico. Those four things fit together like parts of a single tool. Terran knowledge meant more than they knew the mountains. It meant knowing which canyon held water after a dry month. It meant knowing where a trail disappeared onto rock. It meant knowing the places where a small group could hold off a larger force for an hour and then vanish. The Chiricahua homeland and the country south into Sonora and Chihuahua were not empty. They were detailed. They were memorized. Mobility meant not building your whole life around a fixed point the Army could target. It meant traveling light. It meant moving at times, and in ways that cavalry patrols did not expect. It meant splitting, rejoining, scattering, and reforming based on the needs of the moment. This was not an Apache instinct. It was an adaptation to a world where stillness could get your family killed. Family protection was the center of it. In Hollywood, you are shown bands of men as if war happens in a vacuum. In reality, many of the people moving through those mountains were traveling with wives, children, elders. Decisions were not made solely by warriors seeking a fight. They were made by men and women trying to keep the most vulnerable alive while the net tightened. When the army and local militias pursued hostiles, they were often pursuing kin groups, not an army in uniform. And then there was the border. On a map, the line between the United States and Mexico looks clean. In lived experience, it was a strange invention laid over Apache country. For Chiricahua bands, it could function as refuge because it complicated pursuit. Soldiers might hesitate to cross. Commands had to be requested. Jurisdictions argued with each other. A band that crossed south could buy days, sometimes weeks, sometimes a season. But the border was also a trap, because it created two enemies instead of one. Mexican communities in Sonora and Chihuahua had their own long history of raids, reprisals, and hard hatred. Mexican forces pursued Apache bands with local knowledge of their own. And when the United States did cooperate with Mexican authorities, or when American troops crossed anyway, the line that had promised safety could turn into a corridor of pursuit. A Chiricahua group could outrun a column for a time, but they could not outrun scarcity. Water dictated routes, horses required grass, ammunition did not magically replace itself. Every day on the run was a day farther from planted crops, from predictable rations, from any kind of stability. Flight could keep you alive and still grind you down. That is the cruel logic of this phase of the war. The reservation could be deadly in slow motion. The mountains could be deadly in fast motion. And the decision to leave was often made in the narrow space between two kinds of dying. Broken trust sits underneath all of it. Promises made to Cochise had not been made to the system. They had been made by men, and men rotated out. Policies hardened. The pressure from settlers and mining interests did not pause because a family wanted peace. And once you have watched one agreement disappear, it becomes harder to believe the next one will last. So when Chiricahua families fled, when they crossed ridges at night, when they slipped through passes that soldiers could not easily hold, they were not only resisting capture, they were resisting a future in which their children would grow up as prisoners of someone else's paperwork. The United States would call the people who left renegades. The word suggests criminals escaping justice. But if you listen closely to the pattern, another interpretation is possible. They were people trying to stay together, trying to stay alive, trying to keep a little control over where they walked, and when, and with whom. And in those years, the borderlands became the stage for that struggle, refuge and trap at the same time, setting the conditions for the last, most famous, and most misunderstood resistance of the Apache Wars. Out of that tightening net stepped a name that Americans would remember more than almost any other from the entire century of border wars: Geronimo. And the first thing to say before the legend arrives is what he actually was in his own world. Geronimo was a Badan-Kohi and Chiricahua Apache religious figure and a resistance leader. Not a king, not a chief of all Apaches, not a lone outlaw riding for the thrill of blood. He was a man with spiritual authority, a man who prayed and used medicine, and a man whose influence in a small, stressed community could pull others toward a decision to run or fight. The United States loved simple categories: hostile, friendly, outlaw, chief. The Chiricahua reality did not fit. Leadership could be situational. War leadership could sit beside spiritual leadership. And decisions were often made by families and by clusters of relatives under pressure, not by a single centralized command. By the time Geronimo becomes visible in American newspapers, this last resistance was already bigger than one man and older than the headlines. Naishi, the son of Cochise, carried a kind of inherited weight among the Chiricahua. Chihuahua was a formidable war leader. Nana, older now but still dangerous and still moving, carried the memory of Warm Springs resistance and the hard lessons of escape. There were others too, Men whose names appear in military reports for a year and then vanish, and women whose names often do not appear at all, even when they were the ones keeping children alive on those trails. So why does the story narrow around Geronimo? Part of the answer is that Americans could not stop watching him. He escaped and escaped again. He became a repeated embarrassment to a powerful modern state that wanted the Apache problem solved, filed, and forgotten. Each time a band slipped out of a reservation, the newspapers demanded a face to attach to the fear. Geronimo gave them that face. Photogenic, quotable in translation, easy to turn into a symbol. The press did what the press often does in war. It took a collective crisis and condensed it into a single villain or a single celebrity. And Geronimo himself was not invisible. He could be charismatic. He could be uncompromising. He could be persuasive. Army officers and scouts would later describe him as stubborn, as daring, as someone who could keep people moving when their legs, their horses, and their patience had already begun to fail. That kind of personality shows up in the record. But the record also shows something else. He was usually not acting alone, and he was not usually acting as the top political authority. In many of these flights, Naishi is present. Other headmen are present. Decisions unfold through arguments and alliances inside a moving camp, not as orders issued by a single commander. The Last Resistance, then, is not a screenplay about one man against the world. It is a story about a small number of people trying to remain unbroken while the available choices collapse, because pressure was now relentless in a way it had not been in Cochise's time. The reservation system, by the early 1880s, had hardened into something like a machine. Agents changed, policies changed, but the direction stayed the same. More control, less movement, fewer weapons, fewer horses, and the constant threat that an entire band could be shipped somewhere else because someone in Washington wanted a simpler map. The Chiricahua at San Carlos were living among other Apache peoples with their own histories and rivalries, under conditions that bred conflict. Sickness moved through camps. Alcohol moved in from the outside. Accusations, some true and some convenient, became sparks in dry grass, and beyond the reservation fence was a world that was also closing. The border did not protect the way it once had. Telegraph lines carried warnings. Scouts, some Apache, some not, carried trails to the next patrol. Mexican forces in Sonora and Chihuahua, with their own deep history of Apache War, did not need American lessons in how to pursue. The old trick of vanishing into Mexico could still work. But now it meant running into a second set of rifles. So when Geronimo and others chose flight, the method was the same as it had always been, but the margin for error was thinner. Mobility still mattered. A small group could move faster than a column, could split into pieces and rejoin, could travel at night, could climb where cavalry horses struggled. Local knowledge still mattered. The right canyon meant water. The wrong canyon meant a dead horse. The right ridge meant you were a shadow. The wrong ridge meant you were a silhouette. And desperation mattered most of all, because desperation changes what a person is willing to risk. A man who believes capture means prison for his family, or removal to a far place, does not weigh options the way an officer writing a report does. He weighs them the way a father does. The calculus becomes brutal and immediate. That is the context that keeps the story honest, because the legend tends to turn Geronimo into a kind of supernatural fugitive, as if he could disappear by magic and strike by instinct. The documented reality is harsher and more human. They survived by moving constantly through unforgiving country. They survived by taking what they could, sometimes by raiding, sometimes by trading, sometimes by coercion. And that brought retaliation down on them and on people who had little to do with the decisions being made in the mountains. Blood accumulated on all sides. The longer it went on, the harder it became for anyone, Apache or American or Mexican, to imagine an ending that did not involve someone being humiliated. And this is where American memory plays its last trick. It turns the last resistance into the Geronimo War, as if the final chapter of the Apache Wars was a duel between one famous man and the United States Army. But it was also Nietzsche's story, and Chihuahuas and Nanas, and the scouts who tracked their own relatives, and the families who carried children across rock, and the communities in Mexico who lived under threat, and the officers who came to believe that the only solution was to remove an entire people from their homeland. Geronimo became famous, because fame is how empires simplify what they cannot easily control. A complicated conflict becomes one name you can print in a headline. But in the mountains and deserts where this last resistance actually happened, it did not feel like fame. It felt like thirst and pursuit, and arguments around small fires, and the constant question of how long you could keep moving before the world ran out of places to run. And now we have to talk about the men the newspapers rarely made into legends. The Apache Scouts. If you grew up on Hollywood, the idea sounds like a contradiction. Apache men wearing army issue, riding with bluecoats, following the trail of other Apaches. Sometimes following the trail of their own cousins. Sometimes walking into a canyon, where the voices on the far ridge might be speaking the same language they spoke at home. It is tempting to reach for an easy word, traitor, sellout, or on the other side, loyal ally. But those are clean words for a dirty time. And if you want to understand how the last resistance was hunted as hard as it was, you have to understand why the United States Army wanted Apache Scouts, and why some Apache men chose, or were pushed, to become them. The Army had soldiers, it had cavalry, it had better rifles than it used to. It had telegraph lines and forts and supply trains. But it did not have what mattered most in the mountains of southeastern Arizona and the border ranges of Sonora and Chihuahua. It did not have the land inside its bones. An officer could look at a map and see a line of hills. A scout could look at the same hills and see water. He could see a place where a horse would break a leg. He could see where a camp could sit without smoke being visible at sunrise. He could read sign that a white tracker might ride past without noticing. Stone turned over that should not be turned. A branch bent the wrong way. A thin line of ash scattered because someone cooked quickly and moved. And he could do something that terrified the people being pursued. He could guess not just where they had been, but where they were going. That is why scouts became crucial. Not as ornaments, not as mascots, as the cutting edge of pursuit. And that leads to the moral knot at the center of this section. Because the scouts were indigenous men helping an expanding state close a net around other indigenous resistors. In the Apache world, where identity was tied to band, clan, marriage, and old grudges as much as to any broad label outsiders used, that could mean one thing in one valley and the opposite in the next. There were Chiricahua scouts who had reasons to oppose a specific Chiricahua flight. There were White Mountain Apache scouts who had their own history with San Carlos politics. There were scouts who had lost family in raids and wanted payback. There were scouts whose families were on rations and could not afford one more winter of uncertainty. There were scouts who believed, with a cold and practical intelligence, that the war was ending no matter what they personally wanted, and the only question left was who would survive the ending with any leverage at all. And yes, sometimes it was coercion. Even when it did not look like a man being forced at gunpoint. If your family is hungry, volunteer starts to mean something else. If an agent controls the food issue, if soldiers control movement, if imprisonment or shipment to a worse place hangs over every argument, then the space where consent lives gets narrow. A paycheck from the army, a regular ration, a horse, a rifle, a promise. Sometimes kept, sometimes not, that your wife and children would be protected. These were not small things. They were life. The Army understood that too. Officers wrote about it openly. Scouts were paid. Scouts were fed. Scouts were used, and praised when they succeeded, and blamed when they failed. They were expected to do what regular troops often could not: move fast, move quietly, and endure. But survival was not the only motive. There was politics. In the 1870s and 1880s, Apache was not one unified command. It was many related peoples, bands, and local communities thrown together on reservations, forced into proximity, forced into competition. Old rivalries did not vanish because Washington wanted a tidy category. Some men joined the Scouts because it gave them status and a voice with the people who now held power. Some joined because they wanted to protect their own band by proving they were peaceful, by showing usefulness, by building a record that might stop collective punishment. Some joined because they believed, rightly or wrongly, that if they were not the ones doing it, someone else would, and the consequences would be worse. And then, there is the hardest truth to say out loud. Some joined because they believed the resistors were bringing disaster down on everyone. This is where Hollywood fails the most, because it cannot handle the idea that Apache communities argued with each other about what was possible. It wants one people, one mind, one war. But inside San Carlos and the other reservation worlds, there were debates that sounded like family fights. Should we run? Should we stay? Should we fight? Should we negotiate? Should we send word to the soldiers before the soldiers punish us all? Those were not abstract questions. Those were questions asked with children coughing in the night and a thin ration sack in the corner. So when a band broke out, Geronimo and those with him, Naishi and those with him, the Scouts who went after them, were not always hunting strangers. They were hunting a decision. And the contradiction only deepened because Scouts were often asked to do something psychologically brutal. They were asked to read the mind of the people they were pursuing, to think like them, to anticipate them, to enter the same rock country, the same thorn, the same thirst, and say out loud, "If I were them, I would go this way." That is an intimate kind of warfare. It is not just violence. It is knowledge turned against its source. Some Scouts did it with grim determination. Some did it with reluctance. Some refused certain missions. Some deserted. Some tried to warn people ahead of time. The record is uneven because the Army recorded what served the Army, and Apache oral memory carried what it needed to carry. But the shape of the truth is clear enough. These were men navigating a world where every option carried shame, danger, and loss. And here is the point that matters for the story that follows. When the United States and Mexico began to coordinate more closely, when columns began to move like hunters instead of parade ground units, when the last Chiricahua flights found themselves pursued without rest, Apache Scouts were one of the reasons the margin for escape kept shrinking. They were not the only reason, but they were a decisive one. They made the country legible to an army that had once been blind in it. So, if we are going to talk about the final surrender honestly, we have to hold two truths at the same time. One, the Scouts helped end the last resistance. And two, many of the Scouts were also trying, in their own imperfect and pressured way, to save their people from the kind of ending that empires prefer: starvation, annihilation, and silence. Divided loyalties are easy to judge when you are not the one being hunted, and not the one being told that your family will pay for someone else's escape. In that world, morality does not arrive as a clean choice. It arrives as a series of bargains made under threat, and the bitter knowledge that no bargain would be honored forever. And the war was about to prove that in the most final way possible. And so we come to 1886, the year that gets written in textbooks like a period at the end of a sentence. But it did not feel like a period to the people living it. It felt like a closing door. It felt like a net pulled tight. It felt like running out of country. By then the pattern was familiar. A break from reservation control. A flight south into the border ranges. A handful of leaders making decisions in motion. Nash, the Chiricahua hereditary leader, and Geronimo, a Bedunco man known as a spiritual figure, and a relentless advocate for resistance, not a chief of all Apaches, but a man whose voice carried weight in a group that had decided it would rather gamble on the mountains then accept another promise inside a fence. The newspapers liked to talk about Geronimo's band as if it was a single unit with a fixed roster, as if you could count it cleanly. The reality was messier. The group in the final months was not an army. It was a mix. Fighters, families, people who had already surrendered once and then watched the terms change. People who feared prison. People who feared being sent far away. People who had learned, by experience, that a signature on a paper could be undone by an agent with a bad temper and a soldier with an order. We have numbers in some accounts, and they do matter, but they also shift depending on who is doing the counting and what they are trying to prove. So say it carefully. By the final phase, the people still out were few compared to the forces hunting them. And that imbalance is one of the reasons the end came the way it did. The United States Army put a new man in charge. General Nelson A. Miles was not George Crook. Crook had relied heavily on Apache scouts and on a kind of rough frontier diplomacy, talking, bargaining, trying to make surrender feel like a door you could walk through without being crushed in the frame. Miles brought a different style. He believed in pressure, in coordination, in making the fugitives feel, day after day, that there was no gap left in the ring. He increased the tempo, shifted commands, and treated the pursuit like a problem that could be solved if you applied enough organized force. And then he did the thing that seems like a contradiction until you remember everything we just said about scouts. Miles leaned on Apache scouts too, not as an afterthought. As an instrument, scouts moved ahead of columns. They read sign where cavalrymen saw only rock. They found the places where water hid. They understood which ridges could be climbed without breaking a horse and which canyons turned into traps. And just as important as any of that, they understood the psychology of a flight. They understood why a group would circle back, why they would split, why they would take a punishing route that made no sense to an outsider. They could look at a set of tracks and hear the argument that had happened around a small fire before dawn. There is no clean way to talk about this without letting the bitterness sit in the sentence. The last free Chiricahua were being pursued through their own homeland and the borderlands beyond it by men who spoke related languages, men who knew the same plants and the same prayers, men who had their own reasons for wearing army issue. The pursuit went on through the spring and summer, into Sonora and Chihuahua country, where lines on a map did not stop hunger or thirst. Messages went back and forth. Promises were made. Promises were doubted. Surrenders were discussed and then delayed. There were moments when it seemed like the fugitives might come in, and then something, fear, distrust, a rumor of imprisonment, a memory of an earlier betrayal, pushed them back into motion. This is where the story gets told in a way that Hollywood loves. The lone warrior, the last outlaw, the final chase, but the actual ending was not a duel. It was a negotiation under exhaustion in 1886, after contacts and talks that involved General Miles and Apache scouts acting as guides, intermediaries, and pursuers. Geronimo's final surrender came. Naishi surrendered as well. It happened not as a dramatic battlefield defeat, but as a decision made in the shadow of overwhelming pressure. In a world where every mile of free movement was now paid for with more risk than the group could afford, and it was treated, by the army, by the press, by the politicians who wanted closure, as the closing chapter of armed resistance in the Southwest. In a narrow sense, that is true. After 1886, there would be no sustained Chiricahua campaign of flight and raiding that forced the United States to mobilize entire columns across the border, ranges the way it had for decades. The long war that began with misunderstandings, kidnappings, broken treaties, and retaliations was declared finished. But memory did not surrender. Apache memory did not agree on what the surrender meant. Army memory turned it into a triumph of organization. Western myth turned it into a morality play. And inside families, Chiricahua families especially, it remained what it had always been, a story about being run out of choices, because surrender ended freedom of movement. It did not end suffering. The words "come in" sounded like safety to people far away. For the people who came in, it meant chains. It meant separation. It meant being treated not as human beings trying to survive, but as a problem to be shipped. And that is the part most versions of the story rush past. 1886 did not end the Apache Wars the way a curtain falls at the end of a show. It ended them the way a door locks, and everything that came after. The imprisonment, the exile, the long years of being displayed and studied and controlled, was not a footnote. It was the price of the surrender. The door locked. And then the government did what governments have done in so many American wars. It decided what to call the people on the other side of the lock, not neighbor, not former enemies, not a people with a homeland. Prisoners of war. That phrase matters, because it tells you what 1886 really meant in practice. It meant that the Chiricahua people who surrendered, fighters and non-combatants, families and scouts, leaders and children, were not treated as reservation Indians in the ordinary bureaucratic sense. They were held under military control. They were transported under guard. They were confined under guard. And year after year, the United States kept them in that status, not for a season, not for a few hard months, but from 1886 to 1914, 28 years. Long enough for a baby born in captivity to become a grown man before the Army stopped calling him a prisoner. And the first destination was not the Southwest. It was not the sky country of the Chiricahua Mountains or the wide basins of New Mexico where Warm Springs people had once ranged. It was the opposite of that world. The government sent the prisoners east, across an entire continent, into climates and diseases that were not theirs, to places where the air itself could feel like an ambush. Florida. This is the part that sounds like punishment, because it was punishment. Exile is not just distance. Exile is being placed where your knowledge does not help you, where the plants you know are not there, where the old trails are meaningless, where the very skills that kept you alive in mountain warfare, mobility, concealment, a reading of rock and water, cannot be used to bargain with fate. Some of the Chiricahua prisoners were held at old fortifications in Florida, places built for other wars, repurposed now as cages for a war the public was told had ended. And then there was Alabama. Another move, another set of guards, another set of rules that could change without notice. Another reminder that surrender had not bought stability. It had bought custody. The names shift depending on the document you're reading. Chiricahua, Warm Springs, hostiles, renegades, the Geronimo Indians. The paperwork tried to simplify what the people themselves understood clearly, that these were bands and families with their own histories. Some associated with Nishi and Geronimo in the last flight, some swept up because the Army did not want to leave any part of the Chiricahua world intact in Arizona. The point was not precision, the point was removal. And it is here, in the middle of this forced eastward exile, that you see how the war kept going after the shooting stopped. The battlefield ended. The campaign continued. Only now the weapons were orders and rail schedules, quarantine and confinement, ration lists and inspections. The consequences were measured not in miles ridden in pursuit, but in years. The prisoner of war status from 1886 to 1914 is one of those facts that changes the temperature of the entire story. It means the United States did not simply defeat an armed resistance. It held a people as captives for nearly a generation. It made the end of the Apache Wars into a long, controlled afterlife. Then comes the next move, the one that sounds almost administrative until you remember what it meant. The Fort Sill Apache tribe, which preserves the memory of this period with particular clarity, states that the Chiricahua prisoners were moved to Oklahoma in 1894, after imprisonment and exile in Florida and Alabama, Oklahoma, Indian Territory. To say Indian Territory is to step into a whole other American project, one that had been underway for decades. The idea that the solution to indigenous presence was to push it out of the way, to concentrate it, to make it governable, to make it disappear from the places settlers wanted most. By the 1890s, the machinery of removal had already ground through other nations and other homelands. But the Chiricahua, in this specific sense, were still late in arriving to that system because their war had been the last one that the American public watched as a running drama. And that is why another detail matters. The Chiricahua were the last American Indian group relocated to Indian territory, the last. That is a sentence with weight, not because it makes their suffering unique. Other peoples endured removals, confinements, and broken promises that were just as devastating, but because it marks an endpoint in a century-long logic. The relocation policy did not stop because it had reached justice. It stopped because the map had run out of room, because the frontier had been declared closed, because the nation had decided it had finally built enough fences and rail lines to hold what it had taken. So the Chiricahua and Warm Springs descendants carried something heavy into the 20th century. Not only the memory of warfare in the border ranges, but the lived reality of captivity and forced movement, stamped into family stories as surely as any battle. And notice what that does to the usual Hollywood ending. Hollywood likes the surrender because it can roll credits. It likes the idea that the problem was resolved when one man handed over a rifle. But exile does not roll credits. Imprisonment does not resolve anything. It just changes the language from raids and pursuits to shipments and guard rosters. It stretches the war out quietly, into years most people never learn. Into 1894, when the prisoners are moved to Oklahoma. Into 1914, when the prisoner of war status finally ends. And even then, the consequences do not end. Because removal is not only about where a people is placed, it is about what is broken in the placing. Ties to homeland, the right to move, the ability to live without permission, the ordinary dignity of not being counted and recounted and controlled. 1886 locked the door. Florida, Alabama, and Oklahoma were what happened after the lock clicked. And if you want to understand what the Apache Wars really were, you have to follow the story past the last shot, past the last surrender, into the long corridor of exile, where the war kept taking, even when the battlefield went quiet. In 1914, the lock finally opened, not with a ceremony, not with an apology, not with any admission that a people had been held under military custody for nearly a generation. The prisoner of war status ended with paperwork, and the question that followed was the oldest question in this story. Where do you go when the place you belong to has been turned into someone else's map? The government offered options. Some of the Chiricahua and Warm Springs descendants were allowed to go west, to New Mexico, to join the Mescalero Apache reservation. To some outsiders, it looked like a homecoming, because it was the Southwest again, because the mountains were back on the horizon, because the air was closer to what their grandparents had known. But it was not a return to the Chiricahua homeland. It was a new arrangement on a different piece of ground, among relatives but not the same country, not the same canyons and springs that had held the old names, and others did not go. Around 1/3 of the Fort Sill Apache group remained near Fort Sill after release in 1914, while others went to Mescalero. That split is not a footnote. It is the continuation of the same forced separation the wars had always produced, only now it happened under the language of choice, with decades of captivity and loss sitting behind every decision. Think about what stay meant. Stay in Oklahoma, in a place that had once been the edge of a military world that called you prisoners. Stay near the post that had been a destination of removal. Stay where graves were. Stay where children had grown into adults under guard. Stay where the community had learned painfully how to survive inside the American system without being dissolved by it. And think about what go meant. Go to Mescalero. to build a life among kin and to try to reroute identity in a landscape that felt more like the old world than the plains around Fort Sill. Go toward a future where language and ceremony might be carried forward with fewer interruptions. Go because the Southwest called like an ache, even if it was not the same ridgeline, not the same pass, not the same homeland. Either way, it was not a clean ending. It was a people doing what they had done since the first soldiers rode into Apache country, adapting without surrendering who they were. This is where the story changes tone, because if you listen closely, what survived is as important as what was taken. Hollywood taught a simple arc: a lone warrior, a relentless pursuit, a final surrender, the end. But the real inheritance of the Apache Wars is not only in the last holdouts riding out of the Sierra Madre, or in the headlines that used one name, Geronimo, as a container for an entire world. The inheritance is in families holding on to identity through dislocation, in elders telling children who they are when the surrounding country insists on a different story, in community being rebuilt not on the terms of the people who did the removing, but on the stubborn human fact that memory can be organized into a life. The Fort Sill years created their own kind of homeland, not the old homeland of the Chiricahua Mountains, not the old Warm Springs world in New Mexico, but a lived place shaped by endurance. People married, children were born, names were carried forward. Some learned English because survival required it. Some kept Apache languages alive because survival also required that. They built churches and worked army jobs and farmed and served in the United States military in later wars, all while carrying something that did not fit neatly into the nation's victory narrative: the knowledge that they had been held as prisoners long after the public had stopped paying attention. And that is why the memory matters now, because what remains is not just artifacts, or a fort on a map, or a line in a textbook about the end of the Indian Wars. What remains is a living community and a living argument with the way America tells its own past. The earlier themes of this story: homeland, mobility, betrayal, survival, forced separation, do not disappear when the shooting ends. They simply change form. Homeland becomes a question asked by each generation. Is it where your ancestors are buried? Or where you can raise your children safely? Or where the songs make sense? Or where the mountains you recognize still hold water in the right places? Survival becomes something quieter than raiding and pursuit. It becomes enrollment lists and court cases and community meetings. It becomes the fight to be named correctly, to not be flattened into Geronimo's people, as if everyone had made the same decisions, fought the same battles, or wanted the same future. It becomes the work of distinguishing Chiricahua bands and Warm Springs families, and holding those distinctions in place even when outsiders prefer a single label. And forced separation remains the underlying scar, because 1914 did not reverse 1886. It did not put people back where they had been taken from. It did not restore the dead. It did not unwind the years in Florida humidity, or Alabama fences, or Oklahoma Guard rosters. It simply ended the official captivity and left the survivors to build an existence out of what was left. This is what a fuller account does to the meaning of the Apache Wars. It makes the story less cinematic and more human. It replaces the myth of a final showdown with the reality of long administrative violence. It forces you to see that the conflict was never only about one man, or even two men, no matter how famous the names became. It was about land, and the breaking of agreements, and the refusal of a people to become a footnote on their own ground. And it changes what defeat means. Because if defeat is supposed to mean disappearance, then the endurance of descendants. At Mescalero, and near Fort Sill, in families who carried Chiricahua and Warm Springs identity through exile, stands as a kind of answer. Not a romantic answer, not a comforting one, but a true one. The story did not end when the army stopped calling them prisoners. It continued in the hard work of remembering. It continued in the choice, in 1914, to go west or to stay near Fort Sill. and in the fact that either choice was made under the shadow of what had been done to them. And if you take that seriously, then the Apache Wars become something more than a Western. They become an American story about what happens after the credits, about survival as a strategy, memory as a homeland, and endurance as the thing that remains when everything else is taken. And that brings us to the last turn, the one Hollywood usually refuses to make. Because if you say the Apache Wars, most people hear two names, Cochise, Geronimo, one associated with the first great rupture, the other with the last famous resistance. And they are real entry points. They matter. Cochise, a Chiricahua leader who understood his homeland so well that an army could march through it for years and still not control it. Geronimo, a Bedonkohe, Chiricahua religious figure and war leader whose name became a headline, a shorthand, a kind of national obsession. But the wars were never a duel between two men and the United States. They were a grinding collision between a people who lived by mobility and localized homelands, by springs, passes, and seasonal routes, and a set of governments that measured the world in boundaries, deeds, and garrisons. They were shaped by land first. Not land as scenery, land as water, land as grazing. Land as the difference between surviving a summer and dying in it. Land as the thing that makes treaties feel clear on paper and impossible on the ground. And they were shaped by mistrust that did not appear out of nowhere. It accumulated. One kidnapping blamed on the wrong people, one arrest without proof, one promise made by an officer, then reversed by a new officer, one temporary relocation that turns permanent, one agent who cannot deliver rations, one settler killing that goes unpunished, one Apache raid that is answered by a campaign that does not distinguish between a fighting party and a family camp. Each side kept its own ledger. Each side believed it was responding. And somewhere in the middle, what could have been negotiated in one decade became, in the next, something men only knew how to settle with rifles. Military pressure mattered too, but not just in battles. It mattered in forts, patrol routes, scouts, telegraph lines, and supply trains. It mattered in the slow tightening of a net across a landscape that had once allowed a band to vanish into mountains and reappear 100 miles away. It mattered in the way the United States and Mexico could both squeeze the same people from opposite directions, making a border into a trap. Mobility was never just a tactic. It was a way of life. Chiricahua bands were not one single unified army with one chain of command. Warm Springs people were not Chiricahua, even when they fought alongside them or suffered alongside them. Leaders rose for particular moments, for particular families, for particular needs. Some fought, some negotiated, some tried to keep children alive through winters when the outside world called them hostile no matter what they did. And then exile came, which is the part that makes the Wild West framing feel almost childish. Exile is what Fort Bowie was really for, in the end, not just to guard a road, but to hold a pass, to control a throat in the mountains. Apache Pass, with its water and its geography, became a lever. Fort Bowie made the homeland navigable for outsiders and dangerous for the people who had always known it. And after the surrenders, after 1872's uneasy peace, after Cochise's death, after the last flights and the last betrayals, after 1886 and the headlines, the consequence was not simply that one group laid down arms. The consequence was imprisonment, removal, years measured by guard rosters and illness and distance. A war that began as a fight over country ended as a fight over where a people would be allowed to exist at all. So if you came here for Geronimo and Cochise, keep them. They are doorways. But walk through the doorway and you find something larger: land, mistrust, military pressure, mobility, and exile shaping generations. And now I want to hear from you. If this documentary helped connect the dots in a way Hollywood never did, please like the video, subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're listening from. City, state, country, where are you hearing this story from today?